Здравствуйте, друзья! Сегодня у нас...
Hello, friends! Today we have military expert Yigal Levin from Israel at the UATV studio. Let us welcome him. Hello, Yigal.
I welcome you.
Мы очень рады...
We are very happy to see you in our studio and would like to talk about recent events. This is a congress of terrorist parties in Moscow, which was organized by the Kremlin in order to organize their actions and direct them against a common enemy, Israel, and therefore against Ukraine too.
There is nothing to comment on, except that they failed to reach an agreement. They wanted to achieve so-called national unity, the unity of terrorist groups and organizations. This meeting was also held in Moscow, where in addition to the Palestinian Authority, representatives of the Fatah party, the Islamic Jihad, were invited. For a minute, terrorists who are proxies of Iran are arming themselves with Iran and so on. They invited Hamas there. There is no need to mention who Hamas is and what they did. And there are other smaller terrorist groups there, the People's Front, the Democratic Front, and so on, and even smaller groups. The idea was to submerge the Palestinian Authority together with Hamas into the one structure, the so-called Palestine Liberation Organization. In other words, Russia tried to preserve Hamas and Islamic Jihad along the way, but in the end they failed to come to any kind of unity. But Russia itself won political points by itself because our esteemed partners have arrived. How did their foreign ministry report there? Dear partners have come and left and have had dialogues. And Russia is positioning itself here as a supposedly peacekeeper and conductor of processes in the Middle East, and specifically putting pressure on Israel and its complicated relations with Palestinians.
Смотрите, но что...
Look, but what does this say to a person in the West? Like the same Americans. An attempt by Moscow to unite movements that place the United States of America as their main enemy.
This does not mean anything except that Russia is trying to have an interest here. Let me just remind you that they have military bases and helped keep Assad in power in Syria. Think about it. And all these processes, all these things cannot be considered separately. If you take Hamas, it is funded and supported by Iran. Iran, like Russia, has allowed the Assad regime to remain in power and prevent all these revolutionary and rebel groups from overthrowing him. Plus there was ISIS, Kurdish rebels. I don't want to focus now on Syria with all this mess, a huge civil war that has been going on for more than 10 years. But it was Russia and Iran that managed to keep Assad in power together. At the same time, Assad, the Syrian regime, is helping terrorist groups in all kinds of ways. And we see that now Russia, after the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, is increasing cooperation with Iran. More and more they are merging into a single alliance, supplying each other with weapons and finances. Iran is handing over kamikaze drones to Russia. Russia is paying in gold for this. Plus, there are talks about transferring aircraft. I think they have already handed over Yak combat training aircraft to Iran. And now the news was spread by the British media, citing 6 sources that Iran handed over missiles to Russia. The Ukrainian intelligence department did not confirm this data. All these processes are interconnected. Therefore, Russia is well aware that the bottom line is that Israel, despite Israel's fair criticism, was insufficiently involved in the Russian-Ukrainian war entirely on Ukraine's side. Israel supported Ukraine from the very beginning. Israel supports Ukraine's integrity and the Zelensky peace formula. This was announced at a meeting between Netanyahu and Zelensky last year. Humanitarian aid is coming on. It is clear that Israel could do more, and I also insist on this for Ukraine. The bottom line is, despite many such strange positions, Israel is part of the Western world, which is how Russia views it. And Israel's closest and best ally, of course, the United States, despite Israel's complicated relations with America. Again, whoever follows the media is able to see that. Still, the US is Israel's closest ally. But because the US is seen by Russia as its main adversary in the global confrontation, which largely prevented them from absorbing Ukraine quickly in 2022. With the help of HIMARS supplies, artillery and so on, they transferred large sums of money as aid. And so, as a counterbalance to this, of course, they want to play the card of the Arab world as a whole, a card of the Middle East using Arabic and Iranian people. and also Palestinians. Israel is an ally of the US. All the pieces of the puzzle come together from a single picture. In this regard, Russia is absolutely neither a friend of Israel nor a neutral state. This is actually an enemy state. And the further these events develop, the more ordinary Israelis understand, including for ordinary Israelis, that Russia is not just a neutral state or some distant state, but an enemy one.
Смотрите.
Ukraine is now facing an acute shortage of 122mm and 155mm artillery shells. Maybe let's try to tell our American viewers what this further political crisis, uncertainty, and the inability to accept military aid packages for Israel and Ukraine are threatening the United States this month.
Even if we don't go into horror stories which are voiced in the United States that Americans will go to the war if Ukraine loses, the more Russia becomes stronger, the more NATO forces have to be strengthened, and Europe will have to be strengthened. This may lead to the fact that the same American contingent will have to be deployed, and certain processes and hybrid provocations may occur. Russia can do all this very well, starting from Moldova, ending with Poland, the Baltic states, and so on, where they won't be able to brush it off or say, well, give 60 billion and that's it. And where exactly will the group be like the American one in Romania? And they will have to get involved. This is Pandora's box because it's not clear how it might end. At the same time, we can say that Americans are strong. Well, they could step in, hit them on their hats, and so on. But that's not how the picture is viewed here. The main theater of war for the United States, where there will be a confrontation for global hegemony, is China, the Indo-Pacific region, and the AUKUS alliance: Australia, Great Britain, the USA, plus Japan, Canada, and New Zealand. They are precisely designed to confront China. NATO and Europe are seen as a backyard, as a rear. Perhaps when you want to face off in your main theater of operations with China, would you like your backyard to be at ease? Peace and quiet, in order. Ukrainians are putting things in order because they're putting the mad dog, Russia, in its place. It is clear that Americans and Ukrainians have completely different interests. Ukrainians are fighting for their independence, Ukrainians are fighting for their freedom. The survival of the nation is their real task. At the same time, for Americans, it is very important that this backyard is quiet, calm, and controlled, and that Russia is not strong. We want Russia to be weakened, or better to lose altogether, so that NATO can strengthen itself. And this would make it possible to concentrate their resources and efforts on the main theater of operations. Many people in America understand this. If you look at what the US military is saying, here are Republicans, Democrats. Both parties have this understanding very well. And they say that it's their personal American interest. The main thing for them is for Ukrainians to continue fighting there. Taxpayers and American citizens should also understand this. Not in the sense that tomorrow a particular American citizen will be sent to fight with Russia, but in the sense that perhaps in the future a major global confrontation may well occur, again in the Indo-Pacific region. And this could have very unpleasant and unpredictable consequences for America. They create their AUKUS and strengthen themselves for a reason. Moreover, they are creating all their doctrines and military technologies with the expectation of confrontation with China, not with Russia, and so on, namely confrontation with China. They made reforms a few years ago by the Marine Corps. What are the calculations? Desert war again? Another Iraq? No, all the reforms are there. They are aimed at war on islands in the ocean, at sea, in the ocean. That's why they will be well aware that this will just hit them, America's citizens themselves, taxpayers. If this confrontation does not go in their favor in the Indo-Pacific region, for it to go in their favor, they need a backyard. That is Europe, NATO, and Ukraine, of course, providing that everything there is stable, good, and prosperous, including in military terms. Therefore, it's necessary to send Ukraine weapons, projectiles, and money, and so on.
То есть мы можем говорить о...
So we can say that the main theater of global confrontation is the Indo-Pacific region, where we have India, China and the AUKUS alliance. Russia is not seen as the main enemy of the US-led alliance, right?
NATO was created at one time as a specific alliance to hold Moscow back, and the spread of the communist ideology and the expansion of socialist bloc of countries. Globally, this was Russia. Let me remind you that the Soviet Union was rarely mentioned at that time. This was called Russia or Soviet Russia. NATO was created globally to deter Russia, and today NATO, after reforming them and identifying new threats and so on for them, sees Russia as their main adversary. We just need to voice that NATO is still the North Atlantic Alliance. The North Atlantic Bloc is not a global bloc, and its goals are restrained by spreading Moscow's hegemony in Europe. This is how it was originally conceived. And US interests are separate from NATO. They are global because, after all, the US is the global hegemon. For a moment, there are thousands of US bases around the world. In reality, you won't find a place on the planet that doesn't have an American base. And the only real adversary for the US that can challenge this hegemony is China. Not Russia or India, but China. Their doctrines, organizational actions and reforms in the army, even the experience they gained from the Russian-Ukrainian war, they are learning. It is aimed specifically at reforms for the war against China, where it's also very likely that China really has more people than America, just like Russia has more people than Ukraine in proportional proportions. And as expected, China will also threat soldiers ruthlessly in terms of meat assaults as Russia does. So the parallels are very similar. Therefore, many lessons are being learned from the Russian-Ukrainian war. They are taken into account not the war again with Russia, but precisely in terms of the war with China. So yes, for them it is the main theater of military operations and the main common theater of geopolitical confrontation. These are the Indo-Pacific region, Taiwan, South Korea, and the Philippines. That's it. But again, I repeat, this is for our Western audience. When you have your main front, your main theater in the Pacific, it is important for you to keep your rear in order, so that everything is quiet there. Ukraine and Europe are the rear for the United States, and it's important that they also have weapons, finances, and no chaos.
Спасибо, давайте...
Thank you. Let's have a closing question about the war. On the front in Ukraine, we have a situation where enemy forces are superior in the number of airstrikes, infantry and military equipment, an experience similar to Israel's, as Israel almost always fought against more enemies in manpower and equipment. What do the defense forces need to constantly do at the front right now to contain larger Russian forces?
I'm not in the right place and at the right level of competence to advise the Ukrainian General Staff on what to do, but I can tell you what things are obvious when you look at things globally. It is by no means to act symmetrically in the war with Russia, because Russia is numerically superior to Ukraine in everything. If we act symmetrically, Ukraine will lose. It has no chance. Therefore, we must act asymmetrically. Moreover, when Ukraine acts asymmetrically, such as attacks on their oil refineries, on their territory, after which they have now closed exports for 6 months. If you trust information of the Ukrainian intelligence, I see no reason not to trust this info. It's like unblocking a grain corridor. The sinking of Russian warships. This is not an attempt to wait for Turkey to complete the other corvettes that have been ordered. We will wait. Then the corvette is symmetrical against the corvette, the frigate against the frigate, the missile carrier against the missile carrier. We'll try to win. No, the answer is asymmetrical, using kamikaze boats. But if we act asymmetrically against Russia all the time, then there are chances. We need to look for similar methods, including on land. This is the use of all kinds of unmanned systems, but again, not in terms of quantity, but in terms of how they are used. There is some qualitative changes. But again, in order to give specific recommendations, you need to be at the General Staff to understand the full amount of resources that Ukraine has in its hands, so you can think and talk about. But going further on this topic, This includes not trying to play by the rules that Russia imposes on Ukraine. We must understand that Russia has always imposed their rules on Ukraine. The very fact that they launched a limited invasion in 2014, imposing a limited war in Minsk, imposing a limited war in Donbass, and then a full-scale war, which was again imposed within Ukraine itself. No matter how bad things were for Russia itself, things were going well in some places. As it turned out, they were doing successfully there in 2014, where things were going badly, such as liberation of Kherson, when Ukraine has liberated Kherson of the Kharkiv blitzkrieg. But this always happens within Ukraine itself, so this is all just according to the Kremlin's rules. Going beyond these rules is entering Russia. I'm not talking about raids right now, but some serious combined arms operations. This is not an attack on Russian territory with cardboard drones, although cardboard drones are also good, and some kind of jet drones and so on. But this all happening more massively, more seriously and massively now. The refinery I have already mentioned, and this is an infrastructure that is oil producing. It wasn't damaged by cardboard drones. These are serious blows after all. That is, try to always go beyond the limits that Russia imposes on Ukraine. There are lots of ways. Remembering the sea is a very good example, because it's successful. It can be shown that this works. Here, too. Russia tried to impose its own rules of the game with the grain deal, and Putin's blackmail is precisely with this hunger blackmail. Agree to our terms to export grain so that Ukrainian grain and other agricultural products go to Egypt and other countries later. What did Ukraine do? It has completely reset it to zero. Ukraine liberated Snake Island, which made it possible to unblock the corridor and draw warships into ports where they are now hiding from Ukraine because they are simply sinking from Ukrainian drones. We see how Russia tried to impose its own rules and Ukraine simply took them and threw these rules into the trash can by imposing their rules back. This aspect needs to be acted asymmetrically everywhere and all the time. If you constantly find such asymmetric methods, then Ukraine has a chance, and this is the right way to go.
Спасибо.
Thanks. As we have heard many times from Volodymyr Zelensky and other world leaders, Russia understands only the language of strengths and the language of the strong. Therefore, we hope that the further actions of the Ukrainian defense forces will also be asymmetric and just as painful for the aggressor. Thank you very much for your attention and for being in our studio today.
Thanks for the invitation.
Что ж, друзья,
Well, friends, we had a military expert from Israel, Yigal Levin, in our studio. He shared with us some of his ideas about the war between Ukraine and Russia, about the attempts to organize terrorist movements by Moscow, and how this threatens the Western world itself and the United States as such. Thank you for your attention and stay with us. Goodbye.
спасибо за внимание и будьте с нами. До свидания.